y'all, it's another episode of Everybody is a Suspect. Today we are going to be talking about Scream, or rather the murders that were inspired by the movie. We all know that Scream is a meta slasher where killers watched people kill people in the movies and then decided to make their own movie in real life. Well, there was a lot of murders that were inspired by that movie, which is just extreme levels of meta, but I'm gonna get into it. First up, we have Thierry Jardin. Thierry was a 24-year-old lorry driver from Jerpine, Belgium. He had no prior history of violent behavior or psychological problems. In 2001, he convinced his 15-year-old neighbor, Alison Cambier, to come over to his house to exchange cassette tapes. This is Alison Cambier. When she arrived to his house, they began talking, and he made sexual advances towards her, which she rejected. When she rejected him, Thierry got up, went to the kitchen where he was hiding a ghost face mask and 2 large knives, and then he went back into the living room. He attacked Allison and repeatedly stabbed her over 30 times while covering her mouth. After he murdered Allison, he brought her body into his bedroom, he put her on the bed, and he put a rose in between her hands. Thierry called his father and admitted what he had done. While being interrogated by the police, he said he was inspired by the movie Scream. Thierry was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Scream Murders, Part 2. Pictured behind me is 16-year-old Mario Padilla and his 15-year-old cousin, Samuel Ramirez. They were both a really big fan of the Scream movies, and they had become obsessed with them. They had seen the first one many, many times. They started dreaming, scheming, and plotting about ways to murder local teens from their area. They would discuss the movie at school. They would talk about how cool they thought the slayings were in the movies. They would discuss real-life murders, as well as they started planning their own killing spree. On January 13th, 1998, not long after the release of Scream 2, which they both saw, the two boys attacked Mario's mother, Gina Castillo, inside of their California home. Mario repeatedly stabbed his mother while his cousin Samuel Ramirez held her down, and he stabbed her 45 times, using as many as 4 kitchen knives. Oddly enough, Gina was able to reach a phone where she called the police and immediately told on her son. They had planned on killing Mario's stepfather, Pedro Castillo, but he wasn't at home at the time. They had also been sending threatening letters and making threatening phone calls to 2 girls in the area. They had been planning to buy ghost face costumes, knives, as well as voice distorters like the ones used in the movie after stealing money from his mother. On the day of the murder, the 2 boys approached one of their friends named Aaron Hernandez to see if he wanted to join in murdering Mario's mother, and he refused. The presiding judge on this case banned the mention of the movie Scream because they didn't want it to be used as evidence during the trial. He did not want this to be considered the Scream murder case. Before his sentencing, Mario gave an explanation blaming TV and horror films as the reason for his violent fantasies. Mario was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Samuel Ramirez, his cousin, was only sentenced to 45 years in prison. Also, as a side note, this boy has gay face. I don't know how to explain it. He's got gay face. He looks like a gay. The Scream Murders, Part 3. Pictured behind me is 13-year-old Ashley Murray. On January 17th, 1999, him and his 2 friends were on their way to a nature reserve near Harrogate, UK. He was with 14-year-old Daniel Gill and 15-year-old Robert Fuller. They were trying to break into a bird-watching hut at Burke Crag. They were having a hard time breaking into this bird-watching hut, and so one of the boys suggested that they go down to the bottom of the crag. Not entirely sure what a crag is, but British colloquialisms are just a little in my head. The boys told Ashley to go down first. On their way to the bottom of the crag, he heard a bag open and some rustling. He was quoted by saying, "The next thing I knew, I was being stabbed in the face." Daniel and Robert stabbed Ashley 18 times. They stabbed him in the face as well as places all over his body. They wrapped his body in a bin liner and they left him for dead in the woods. But Ashley didn't die. He was laying there in the forest for 40 hours, unable to move or speak. He was discovered by the dog of an elderly man who was walking through the area. He was suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, and paralysis. Ashley spent 9 months in the hospital, receiving many surgeries for his injuries. After questioning Ashley for 15 minutes, they were finally able to make out the names of the people who had done this to him. This is 14-year-old Daniel Gill, and this is 15-year-old Robert Fuller. They had seen the movie Scream and were motivated to carry out this horrendous attack on one of their best friends. They were detained and they were sentenced to 6 years at a detention center. 6. They were released after 3 years on good behavior. Ashley never fully recovered from this attack, developing a lifetime of trust issues as well as permanent disability. His big toe had to be amputated from the frostbite he developed after laying in the forest for 40 hours. As an adult, he had moved on with his life. He had moved into his own apartment. He was more or less able to take care of himself, got himself a girlfriend, and he was still living in Harrogate, UK. He also said that he saw Gill and Fuller walking about around town as if nothing had ever happened. Unfortunately, in 2012, Ashley Murray crashed his Porsche into a car and was killed in the accident. This was one of the most bizarre endings to one of these cases of any of the ones that will be mentioned in this miniseries. I don't understand how they did not spend the rest of their lives in prison. And if they were in America, they would have. The Scream Murders, Part 4. Pictured here is 15-year-old Alice Beaupère. In 2002, in a town called Saint-Sébastien-sur-Loire, a 17-year-old boy, only known as Julien for legal reasons, invited Alice to meet him in the town square. Julien had been watching the Scream trilogy and became obsessed with the films. He had been talking to his friends at school about what it would be like to murder someone and even devised a plan to murder local girls from the area. It's almost like all of these killers are following the exact same formula. Alice arrived at the town square and Julien appeared and stabbed her 42 times while wearing a ghost face costume. Julien disappeared after this. A local passerby discovered Alice bleeding out in the town square, and she was able to say the name of the person who killed her before she passed. This is a photo of that town square. It has been renamed after her, so it is now Square Alice Beaupère. There was a closed trial held for Julien, and his name has been redacted from any articles on the topic. You cannot find his true identity anywhere. He did claim to regret his actions, and the lawyers in this case argued that he had become very withdrawn and unhappy, and his parents hadn't noticed or done anything about it. They also argued that you can't ignore the impact of the movie on Julien's psyche, which I think is kind of bullshit. They sentenced Julien to 22 years in prison in 2004, which means he will be released in 2026. I read several articles on the topic, not that there's like a whole lot to go around since this did happen in Western France in 2002. So there wasn't like a whole lot of media coverage around it. I did look for Julien's real name, but his name was redacted from any articles. Also, his parents' names were redacted from any of the articles. I do know that he went to Bourdonnière High School in Nantes, France, in between 1999 and 2003, since he was a junior when he committed this murder. So if anybody actually wants to find out who this person is, be my guest, but I couldn't do it. The Scream Murders, Part 5. Last but certainly not least, we have Cassie Joe Todd. You may have heard of this case before. It's been getting kind of popular on TikTok, but I feel like to finish out this whole mini-series, it's a good idea to include probably the most popular murder associated with the Scream movies. This is a photo of Tori Adamczyk and Brian Draper. They were both 16 years old in 2006. They had been best friends since they were children when their parents moved them both to Pocatello, Idaho. They were both really big fans of horror and true crime, one of their favorite movie trilogies being, obviously, the Scream franchise. These two, just like the other murderers in this miniseries, started plotting and scheming about ways that they could murder their friends in the same style as the movie. They were even filming all of their plotting and scheming about the girls that they wanted to murder from their high school. Cassie was included on the list of girls that they were looking to murder. The three of them had had some classes together while they were in high school, and they had been friends for at least a couple of years. The two boys had heard through Cassie's boyfriend that she was going to be house sitting at her aunt and uncle's house taking care of their pets. Her and her boyfriend were going to hang out at their uncle and aunt's house for a little while, and Brian and Tori decided to convince them to invite them over. On the night of September 22nd, 2006, Cassie's boyfriend Matt Beckham joined her at her aunt and uncle's house around 6 p.m. Brian and Tori arrived later to come and hang out at the house with them, and Cassie gave them the grand tour, showed them the entire house. The four of them sat down to watch Kill Bill Volume 2, but not long after the movie started, Brian and Tori said that they wanted to go to a local movie theater to catch a new movie. On their way out of the house, they made their way down into the basement and unlocked the back door so that they could make their way into the house. They left the neighborhood briefly, but they came back and they parked away from the house. This is where they put on costumes, dark clothes, dark gloves, and white masks, and then re-entered the house through the basement door. They could hear Matt and Cassie still watching the movie upstairs, so they started making a lot of loud noises in the basement to try to lure them down there. This attempt proved unsuccessful, and so they started messing with the circuit breaker. They actually started turning off the lights in the house. After Brian and Tori shut off the lights, Cassie became really scared. One of the dogs Cassie was babysitting started barking and growling at the basement stairs. Matt Beckham, her boyfriend, called his mother and asked if he could stay the night at the house with her to make her feel safe. Matthew's mother denied his request, but did offer to let Cassie sleep at their house instead, and then she would drive her back over the next morning. Cassie felt that it was her responsibility to stay and take care of the animals, so she refused. At 10:30 p.m., Matthew's mother came and picked him up, and they left the house with Cassie still in it. Matthew called Brian and Tori after he left to see where they were to possibly meet up later, but Brian was whispering into the phone. He assumed that they were in a movie. After they were sure Beckham was gone, they turned off the lights in the house again to try to trick Cassie into coming down into the basement. But she didn't. Eventually, Brian and Tori just went upstairs. They slammed a closet door at the top of the stairs to scare Cassie, who was lying on the couch, and then they attacked her. Using 2 knives, the boys stabbed her over 30 times, 12 of those stab wounds being potentially fatal. Cassie's body was discovered on Sunday afternoon by her 13-year-old cousin. It did not take long for investigators to track down Brian and Tori, as they were one of the most recent people to be at the house. After interrogating Brian and Tori, neither of their stories were lining up, and neither of them could tell the police about the movie that they had supposedly seen. Both of the boys blamed each other, and eventually Tori took investigators to where they had hidden the evidence at Black Rock Canyon. It was here that they discovered the knives, the masks, the costumes, and also the video recordings of them plotting Cassie's murder. On September 27th, 2006, 5 days after the murder took place, the boys were charged with first-degree murder. Both of them were sentenced to life without parole. The boys and their lawyers have made several appeals over the years to have their sentences reduced, all of which have been rejected. However, in 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a sentencing of life without the possibility of parole for juveniles is unconstitutional, even in cases of murder. The U.S. Supreme Court will be looking at over 1,500 cases, as the ruling needs to be applied retroactively. This means that these two could be getting their sentences shortened. This man murdered 5 college students in Gainesville, Florida back in the 1990s. He even decapitated one of those college students. His murders inspired an entire horror movie franchise. Keep watching to find out what happened. Hey everyone, welcome back to Everybody is a Suspect. I know it's been a minute since I posted my last TikTok, but trying to get a business started and doing a whole new TikTok, it's a lot of work, but I will put out as much as I possibly can. Now, this is part 7 of my Scream murder series. I know there's so many freaking parts to this, but I really enjoy having a lot of installments, so let's get into this story. On August 24th, 1990, Danny Rolling broke into the apartment of 2 university freshmen, Christina Powell and Sonia Larson, and they were both 17 at the time. He found Christina Powell sleeping on the couch in the living room, but he decided to go upstairs to where Sonia Larson's bedroom was, and he found her sleeping in her bed. He taped her mouth shut, and then he stabbed her with a kabar knife and killed her in her room, and she died trying to fend him off. He went downstairs and he did the same thing to Powell. Danny Rolling also posed his victims in sexually provocative situations to scare, add a little more fear to the people who found their bodies. Already from the first 2 murders, you can tell why this became a horror franchise. A day later, on August 25th, 1990, he broke into the apartment of 18-year-old Christina Hoyt. Now, she wasn't home when he arrived, so he waited there for her to return to her apartment. And when she did, he surprised her from behind and attacked her, and he stabbed her in the back, rupturing her aorta. At this point, he flipped her over and he cut her from her groin to her sternum, and then he left the apartment. Now, once he got back to his campsite, which was near the university, he discovered that he did not have his wallet on him, and he figured he must have left it at Christina's apartment. He returned, he found his wallet, and then he decided to cut off Christina's head and pose her body in sexually provocative situations, and then he put her head on the shelf, like on her dresser, facing her own corpse to add fear to anybody who discovered her body. At this point, the murders garnered widespread media attention, and university students started taking precautions to make sure that they were safe. They started sleeping together in groups, walking together from class to class, things like that. Many students actually dropped out of the university and transferred to an entire university altogether, which is exactly what I would have done. So at this point, 3 women have been murdered, and now the University of Florida, everybody in Gainesville is freaking out, and it's garnered widespread, national media attention. This is Tracy Pauls and Manuel Taboada. They were both 23 years old at the time of the university murders. On Monday, August 27th, just 2 days after the murder of Christina Hoyt, Danny Rolling broke into their apartment. He attacked Manuel first and killed him after a struggle. Tracy heard all the commotion, and so she went down the hall to Manuel's room and found Danny Rolling standing in his bedroom. So she barricaded herself in her bedroom. Unfortunately, Danny Rolling was able to break through the door. Danny Rolling taped her mouth and wrist together, he cut off her clothes, he SA'd her, and then he stabbed her in the back multiple times. Danny posed Tracy's body in sexually suggestive positions, but he actually left Manuel's body in the same position it was he had died in. With the exception of Manuel, all of the women Danny murdered were petite white brunettes with brown eyes who looked a lot like his mother. These are photos of the other 3 victims, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, and Sonia Larson. Louisiana police alerted Florida authorities about an unsolved triple murder in Shreveport that bared some real similarities to the murders that were being committed in Gainesville. 3 members of the Grissom family had been murdered in Shreveport: 55-year-old William Grissom, his 24-year-old daughter Julie Grissom, and her 8-year-old son Sean. Investigators from Florida flew out to Shreveport, Louisiana to compare their blood samples, and they discovered a match. The same person who killed the family in Shreveport had also killed the same people in Florida. A woman by the name of Cindy Jurikich called in a tip to Crime Stoppers about Danny Rolling, and he had already been arrested for an attempted robbery of an Ocala supermarket. They matched his blood, they found his campsite, they found a ton of evidence pointing to him being the murderers of all of those Gainesville students. There was even a tape recorder where he was making audio diaries of what he had done to the students in Gainesville. Rolling was executed at Florida State Prison on October 25th, 2006 by lethal injection. Kevin Williamson was inspired to write Scream because of these murders. Like and follow for more.